Chapter 1 A Deadly Year. The Great Plague of London, 1665. The rat looked dead. Good woman Phillips nudged it with her toe to be sure. It didn't move. She bent down, pinched its tail between her thumb and forefinger, and lifted the rat up so it dangled limply before her face. "Come into my kitchen and die on my kitchen floor, will you?" she said mimically to the little corpse. "We'll see about that, you dirty beast." Good woman noticed with digest that fleas were still jumping in the rat's coarse black fur. It hadn't been dead for long, probably frozen to death. The winter of 1665 was the coldest she could remember. She opened the door and swung the rat by its tail, flinging it as far from the house as she could. It landed with a thud in the gutter. "Good riddance," thought Goodwoman Phillips. She wiped her hands on her skirt before heading inside to make breakfast. She thought no more about the rat that day. She was a busy woman with a husband and sons to feed. A poor family like hers, living outside the walls of London, in the rough and tumble parish of Stategills, in the fields, food was often hard to come by. Worse, with this winter's dreadful cold, they needed more fuel than usual for the fire. Good woman feared that the extra expense would mean Christmas, not even a week away, would be lean and dismal holiday this year. Good woman Phillips was right to worry about Christmas. There would be no celebrating in her home as that dark December day wore on. Her head began aching and pain grew in her back, arms, and legs until she could hardly stand. Then fever and chills set in. By evening, she was forced to stay to her bed. She lay in a daze, trying not to moan. Signs in the sky. Day by day, good woman Phillips got sicker. Her son sat by her bedside in the evening, trying to distract her with the latest news from London. The whole city was buzzing with rumors about the comet had been sent that had been seen flaring across the heavens every clear night since November. Many believed that the comet was a sign of God from God to England's King Charles II, who had been on the throne for just 4 years. People remembered an old superstition that the crowning of a new king would be followed by plague. These blazing stars threatened the world with flame, plague, and wars. The two princes, princes, death to kingdoms, many crises to all estates, inevitable losses, was the dismal forecast of one popular astrologer. As a flash wave of fear shocking Goodwoman Phillips, her sons crept away, leaving her to rest. Soon as she tossed, as soon as she, soon she was tossing in a restless, feverish sleep. House call. When Goodwoman Phillips opened her eyes next, it was light in the room. A tall man in a long coat was unpacking a leather satchel and laying out items along the wooden bench under the window. A cup, a cloth, a knife. Goodwoman realized at once who this man was and why he was there. A doctor. I'm I'll not be bled, she tried for a firm, clear tone, but even to her own ears, her voice was low and flattering. The doctor turned and looked at her calmly. "Good Phillips, your husband and sons have consulted me about your case. Waiting will balance the humors within your body. It is for the best." The doctor came closer. She could see the knife glinting in his hand. Then it was done. A smooth, quick cut on her arm. Blood dripped into the cup he held up. Her head thudded, and the room seemed to lift and tilt, then spin. "Fainted," said the doctor. "Not uncommon for one so far gone with fever. Let's hope this bloodletting was done in time." Good woman Phillips didn't wake up again on Christmas Eve of 1664. She died, the first victim in an epidemic of plague that was to kill nearly 1 in 5 Londoners over the coming year. It's not funny, it's humoral. From ancient times until the 19th century, when the doctors told you your humors were out of balance, he didn't mean that there was something wrong with your funny bone. Humoral theory was one of the key principles in Western medicine. According to this theory, first proposed by the doctors of ancient Greece, the human body contained 4 humors or fluids: black bile, also known as melancholy, yellow or red bile, blood, and phlegm. Your health depended on maintaining the right humoral balance or mix of fluids inside your body. Curing disease was a matter of putting the humors back in balance. This is where the idea of bleeding patients came from. God have mercy upon us. A neighbor woman came that afternoon to wash the body and prepare it for burial. When the neighbor removed good woman Phillips' nightdress, she gasped. Large red rings had appeared on the dead woman's chest and back. Under her right arm was an ominous purple swelling. "An obi, plague tokens," whispered the shaken woman. "Plain as my hand, these are the signs. This is a plague house. Oh God, have mercy on us." She turned and fled down the stairs and out of the house. Before long there was a knocking at the door of the Phillipses' tiny house. The searcher had arrived. It was the searcher's duty to visit every house where a death occurred in state guilds in the fields, to examine the decrease and to report back to the parish clerk, who recorded the cause of death in the parish register. All 119 London parishes kept registers of birth and deaths. Bulky volumes filled with line after line describing death from old age, accidents, and illnesses of every kind. Yet of all the ways to die in 1664, none was more feared than plague. For plague could spread through a neighborhood like fire in a matter of weeks. Plague could engulf a whole city, even a whole country. The searcher for state guilds in the field was a shrunken, wrinkled old woman. She was desperately poor and spent every cent she had on ale at the inn. It was well known as that she gladly take a coin or two should a family wish to have the cause of death changed in the report she delivered to the parish clerk. For a small tip, a suicide could become an accident. Even plague could be registered as a simple fever, but the Phillips family had no money to offer her. Her sons had spent everything they had to bring the doctor in to bleed their mother. The searcher peered down drunkenly at the body, then reeled away in alarm at the sight of the swollen lumps, called bubbies, proof that good woman Phillips had died of the disease. We now know that as bubonic plague. She staggered off, returning later with men from the parish office who began boarding up the doors and windows. The dead woman's family would not be allowed to leave their house for weeks, in case they spread plague to others. Inside the dark house, Goodwoman Phillips and his sons listened as nail after nail was pounded into the boards, blocking their windows. Finally, the pounding was replaced by the softer sound of brushes. A huge red cross was paint, painted on their door, and the words, "God have mercy upon us." Those signs let everyone in the neighborhood know that his house was cursed with the plague. That Christmas Eve, all was silent in the Phillips house. Good woman's husband and sons could only wait and wonder which of them would be next. Outside, their neighbors crossed the street to avoid walking past the boarded-up house, fearing that if they came too close, they would be contaminated with plague seeds. The fear built. A little more than a week after the death of Goodwoman Phillips, soon after New Year's, John Gunt stepped to the door of his London shop and tossed a coin to one of the rag boys shivering in the frosty January air outside. "Run and fetch me a copy of the bills of Marilee. The first bill of the year was printed this morning, and I'm anxious to see it. You'll find me in a generous mood to repay you for your speed." As he watched the boy disappear up the cobbled road, John considered how surprising it was that the bills of morality, a page of statistics listing the week's birth and death in each London parish, should have become so popular with readers. Each week in the coffee houses and the taverns, conversation was sure to turn to the latest news in the bills, especially if there were any unusual deaths. John Gunn always found the bills of Montgomery fascinating, but he'd heard that there was something he would find particularly interesting in this week's edition. And when the errand boy ran back with the page fluttering in his hands, it didn't take long for John to spot it. Death by Plague 1. London hadn't had an epidemic of plague for nearly 20 years, and plague usually struck in the hot months of summer, not in the midst of the coldest winter that anyone could remember. But all the same, John decided to keep a close eye on the bills over the next few months. For the rest of that cold, dark winter, while all of London was watching the sky, John was scanning the list of death, reading the signs there that told him an epidemic of plague was coming again, looking for answers. As the owner of Popular Haberdashery, a store selling cloth, John Grant was an expert on everything from the coarse cottons to the finest silks and velvets, along with buttons, thread, and ribbons, and every color of the rainbow. But running a successful business wasn't enough to keep John's active mind occupied. He really wanted to make a name for himself as a scientist or a scholar. He'd always been fascinated with the weekly bills of morality, and by the late 1650s, he had saved several years' worth of weekly statistics. John realized that those dusty stacks held a treasure trove of information. A businessman, he knew the value of having information about his customers. He needed to know approximately how many birds to expect each year so that he could stock the right amount of delicate linen for cushioning robes. And by knowing how many deaths were there might be in a year, he could have enough cloth for murmuring clothes on hand. At the time, there was no source for this kind of data. John, like other shopkeepers, was forced to depend on his intuition and experience when ordering his stock. Yet, since 1592, the weekly bills of morality had been tracking these numbers and more. By reading through all the bills and adding up the deaths and the births, John realized he would be able to work out annual averages and perhaps find useful patterns. He began to wonder what other uses there might be for information about birth and death rates in the city. Comparing the numbers of deaths and their causes from one year to another might reveal patterns not only in how many people were dying, but also why. John Grant decided that he had found the perfect subject for a scientific study. What about dying of curiosity? Plague wasn't the only thing killing Londoners during the 17th century. The bills of mortality were full of unusual ways to die, some that you are not likely to see in the obituary today include stoppage in the stomach, twisting of the guts, eaten by lice, and the mysterious horseshoe head. Success at last. John Grant collected all the bills of mortality from the past 60 years and studied them, looking for the secrets that they held about London life. In 1662, he published his findings in a short book with a long title, Natural and Political Observations, mentioned in a following index and made upon the bills of mortality, with reference to the government, religion, trade, growth, air, diseases, and the several changes of the said city. His book was an instant hit, and in 1663 John was admitted to a very exclusive club of scientists, the Royal Society of London for improving natural knowledge. Although John Modesty described his accomplishment as just shopkeeper's mathematics, he developed a method for predicting the arrival of plague year. This was a tremendous scientific advance for more than a century. The people of London had suffered regular epidemics of plague, one almost every 20 years. Tens of thousands had died, and the city's inhabitants lived in fear of the next outbreak. By studying the bills of materiality, John realized that in the months leading up to an outbreak of plague, deaths from all causes were higher than usual. Sickly years, he called them. The winter of 1664 was the start of a very sickly year in London. Goodwoman Phillips' death was the first one to be recorded as plague, but he was sure it wouldn't be the last. Blast from the past. Many people have heard of the Black Death, the pandemic of plague in the Middle Ages that killed almost a third of the people in Europe. But the world has suffered through not just one, but three plague pandemics. The plague pandemic. The first is known as the Plague of Justin, named after the Roman Empire Justin the First. The disease first broke out in considerably modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, in 541 CE. It swept through the city, killing up to 5,000 per a day, 5,000 people a day, before going on to spread across Spain, Italy, Africa, and the Middle East. Over the next 3 years, it killed as many as 50 million people. Afterward, plague outbreaks continued, but didn't reach pandemic levels again until 1347, when traders and invading armies carried the disease into Europe. Whole villages were wiped out by the Black Death. Crops went unharvested and trade stopped. Some historians think 1/3 of the population died in the pandemic. It took 200 years for the population to recover. The next great pandemic of plague started in 1855 and lasted 100 years. Rats hiding in steamships carried the disease across the world, causing outbreaks in port cities on every continent. Over 15 million people died. Will there be a fourth pandemic of plague? Is it possible that, but unlikely? Plague can now be treated with antibiotics, and thanks to modern hygiene, many cities are cleaner with fewer rats. The sickly year theory. By watching the number of deaths closely and seeing as they began to rise each week, John Grant was able to predict a plague epidemic. He looked at all deaths, not just from plague, because he knew the system for recording deaths in London wasn't very accurate. Years before, King James the First had ordered each London parish, the district surrounding at a church, to begin keeping track of all the local births and deaths. Officials called parish clerks were in charge of the records, since there weren't enough clerks to track down all the births and deaths in the crowded city. They depended on searchers, like the one who visited Goodwoman Phillips' home to collect the information they needed. This system had a few problems. For one thing, the searchers had no medical background. When it wasn't clear that someone had died from they had to guess. This led to some unusual entries in the bills of mortality, like teeth, pinning, evil fools, etc., and found death. In addition, the searchers weren't paid much, so for the price of a drink a for a price of a drink and a few extra pennies, may searchers would agree to write down anything they were told. When someone had died of plague, their family would be eager to bribe the researcher to cover it up. Otherwise, the whole family would be shut up in the house to prevent them from spreading plague seeds. John Grant estimated that up to 20% of plague deaths were recorded as something else in the bills of mortality. The third problem was the parish clerks only recorded the births and deaths of citizens who belonged to the official religion, the Church of England. This created big gaps in the official statistics because it left out other religious groups: Jews, Catholics, Quakers, and non-conformists. There were a few more plague deaths in London through the rest of that cold winter, and and as the weather warmed up, the numbers began to increase. In the first week of June, 43 deaths from plague were recorded, as many as there had been for the whole year up until then. The next week there were 112. By fall that year, 7,000 people were dying each week. Plague had returned to London with a vengeance. Soon anyone could afford to leave the city, begin packing their bags. John Grant stayed where he was. He had his shop to look after, but more importantly, he wanted to keep an eye on the information coming from the apprentices each week. His theory about sickly years leading to plague years was being proven before his very eyes. Tool of trade descriptive ep- ep- epidemiology. Ep- epidemiology is all about looking at the big picture of a decreased outbreak, while physicians try to help individual patients get well. In, epidemiologists help to keep us from getting sick in the first place. To do this, they need to understand who is getting sick, what's causing the disease, and how is it spreading. Once they have that information, they can try to figure out how to stop the outbreak. Most countries today keep track of deaths and any unusual cases of infectious diseases. In 1665, there was very little of this kind of information. John Grant was the first person in England to recognize that keeping accurate records of the number of people who died each year could help fight disease. His analysis of the bills of mortality for 1664 and 1665 is one of the earliest examples of what we now call descriptive epidemiology. It is the first step in putting together the big picture of a disease outbreak. For an epidemiologist, putting together that big picture means using data, lots of it, to describe the who, what, when, and where of the outbreak. The answers to these questions are clues to how and why the epidemic is spreading, information that they can use to fight the disease. Stay apart to stay alive. As the death count rose in London over the summer of 1665, the king took action to try to contain the spread of plague. He issued a proclamation banning all public gatherings, even funerals. The theaters and pubs were forced to close along with the universities. Parliament was cancelled, all trade was stopped. Scotland closed the border with England to try to keep the plague out. As a result of the government's actions, many people lost their jobs, but many more likely owed their lives to this early example of social distancing, a measure to prevent infection that would be used again and again in epidemics right up to the present day. The streets are empty. By mid-July, there were 1,000 people dying in London each week. By September, it was up to 1,000 a day. A Londoner named Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary, "But now how few people I see, and those walking like people that have taken leave of the world." Samuel was a successful businessman, but unlike most wealthy people, he didn't leave London during the plague. Instead, he stayed and recorded his impressions in his diary, which was published almost 2 centuries later. It is one of the most revealing records of what life was for people in London during the trouble year. In the fall, with plague raging across the city, Samuel wrote, "Lord, how empty the streets are, and melancholy, so many poor sick people in the streets, full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard as I walk. Everybody's talking of this dead and that man sick, and so many in this place, and so many in that. And they tell me that in Westminster there is never a physician and but one apothecary left, all being dead, but that there are great hopes of a great decrease in this week. God sent it. Sure enough, as fall turned to winter and the weather became colder, the plague deaths began to subside. At the end of the year, as people began cautiously returning to the city, John Grant published his analysis of the epidemic called London's Dreadful Visitation, or a collection of all the bills of mortality for this present year. It is estimated that 60,000 people out of a population of 450,000 who had died of plague. In a single year, the disease had wiped out 15% of London's population. New knowledge, but no cure. By looking carefully at statistics, John Graham helped people realize that epidemics could be predicted. High numbers of unusual deaths might point to the start of an outbreak of disease. People no longer had to look to the stars for signs of a coming epidemic. They just had to pay attention to what was happening around them. It was the beginning of a more scientific approach to disease control and prevention. Still, much about plague remained a puzzle in 1665. How did the disease start? How did it spread? How did you catch it from breathing infected air? From contact with a victim? Could you get it from something you ate or drank? There were no answers to these questions, which made preventing and treating plague a risky guessing game. To avoid catching plague, some doctors held gold coins in their mouths while they treated patients, believing the precious metal protected them. Others recommend burning herbs and spices mixed with vinegar or tar to clean the air. So many people believed that smoking tobacco would prevent plague, that schoolboys were punished if they forgot to smoke each morning before their prayers. Some people wore amulets filled with toad poison to ward off the disease, and non-con artists sold worthless powders and mixtures, passing them off as exotic wonders drugs. Powdered unicorn horns, phoenix eggs, and the kidney stones of camels. There was no way to cure plague, and the doctors could do little to treat it. Bleeding had been recommended as a cure for fevers since ancient Greek and Roman times, although people often died from loss of blood. Doctors continued to bleed their patients. Sweating was another common treatment. It was based on the idea that would be that that bec- it was based on the idea that because plague caused fevers, it should be treated with heat. Doctors piled on the blanket and stoked up a fire near the victim's bed, hoping that that their patient would sweat out the plague poison. If neither bleeding nor sweating worked, there was opium to dull your pain, if you could afford it. When that failed, there was only prayer left. According to John Grant's statistics, there were only 9,967 births in London that year, compared to 97,306 boroughs. Some wondered if the city's population would ever recover. John pointed out that London was an incredibly dangerous place to live at all times. Every year there were far more deaths in the city, more than there were births. And yet the population continued to grow because people from the surrounding countryside were constantly coming countryside coming to London, looking for work and a better life. John predicted with John John predicted that within a few years London population would rebound thanks to newcomers from the country. Again, he was right. Slowly, life began to return to normal in the city as people forgot the year of terror and death. Grant's legacy. John Grant's discovery that plague years were preceded by sickly years was a huge step forward in tracking diseases. His recommendation that doctors and health officials pay close attention to all unexplained increases in death rates is still helping epidemiologists pinpoint and stop disease outbreaks today. It was only after the Spanish influenza pandemic in the early 20th century that investigator Wade Hampton Frost realized the rates of pneumonia had been unusually high in the months leading up to the massive outbreak of the flu in U.S. Army camps. Looking back, Wade suspected that what doctors had been calling pneumonia had really been early cases of Spanish influenza. If someone had remembered the lesson of John Grimm and looked into the sudden jump in pneumonia cases, it might have led to an earlier identification of the illness. The Spanish flu kept through the United States before going global, killing millions worldwide in the winter of 1918. In 2019, when doctors in Wuhan, China noticed more familia cases than usual, they were quick to let the authorities know, hoping to avert another pandemic, but the virus had a head start. Unequal treatment. In 1665, only the wealthy and middle class could afford doctors. The thousands of poor people who suffered from plague during the London epidemic mostly relied on low-cost home remedies. A booklet from the Royal College of Physicians called Certain Necessary Directions for the Prevention and Cure of the Plague recommended this surefire method for treating painful swollen lymph glands or bubbies, bubbies, bubbies. Pull off the feathers from the tails of living cocks, hens, pigeons, or chickens, and holding their bills, hold them hard to the botch or swelling, and so keep them at that part until the birds die. And by this means, draw out the poison. No chickens handy. There were alternatives. Take a great onion, hollow it, put into a figure cut small, put into a wet paper and roast it in embers. Apply it hot unto the tumor. The popular remedy was called Vince treacle. A treacle is a thick syrup. To make it, you'll need nearly 60 ingredients, from cinnamon, pepper, and cloves to exotic items like viper flesh, opium, beaver glands, and dead sea salts. Vipers all sold out. London treacle was a simpler option, a mixture of cumin seeds, bayberries, snake root, cloves, and honey. Finding answers in Hong Kong. More than 200 years after the epidemic in London, scientists finally identified the source of the plague in 1894. An epidemic of bubonic plague in Hong Kong killed 80,000 people. The governor, Sir William Robinson, called the scientists to come to Hong Kong to search for solutions and save the city. A famous Japanese scientist, Shibuyasu Ryo Kasuto, answered his plea. Shibuya's arrival was celebrated in the papers, and he was given his own laboratory and a staff of assistants. Nobody paid much attention to another foreign researcher who answered the call for help. Alexander Yersin was a young Swiss bacteriologist, a scientist studying disease carrying microbes and how to cure or treat the illnesses they cause, who had been practicing medicine in the French colony of Indochina. Now the countries of Vietnam and Cambodia as in unknown scientists, Alexander didn't get the same warm welcome as the famous Shibuya. The Hong Kong officials didn't even offer him a laboratory. He had to pay to have his own lab built. A lowly straw but hut, not far from the much grander building occupied by Shibiaspio. The two scientists were soon racing to be the first to discover the source of plague. The competition was so fierce that Shibiaspio tried to prevent Alexander from getting access to the bodies of plague victims. Alexander had to bribe the soldiers guarding the plague wards of hospitals to bring him the limited blood and issue samples he needed. That June, each man announced that he had successfully isolated the bacteria that causes plague. At first, Shibiasko was credited with the discovery, but then the scientific community decided that Alexander had been first, and the bacteria was named Yersinia pestis in his horror. A few years later, French researcher Paul Louis Simon discovered that fleas called Xenopsila chipios transferred the infection from rat to rat. When a rat died, its fleas sometimes jumped to a nearby human. Their bodies passed the disease to humans. It took nearly 40 years for Simonton's research to be accepted by the scientific and medical communities, but the mystery of plague was finally solved. The Cotton Connection. London's Great Plague may have started when infected rats and their fleas hatched a ride to the city on bales of cotton imported from Holland just the year before. More than 50,000 people had died in a plague epidemic in Amsterdam, Holland, and there was a busy trade in cotton between the two cities. The first death in the London epidemic happened in a neighborhood called Steakles in the Fields, where many dock workers lived. These workers could have been bitten by plague-infected fleas while unloading bales of cotton from the boats and bringing it into the city for sale. Ironically, John Grant may have been selling cloth made from that cotton in his shop while spreading his evenings tracking the spread of epidemic it had caused through his city. Trade level and disease have a long history of connection from the trade of caravans that brought plague rats to Europe from Central Asia, to the slave ships that carried mosquitoes breeding yellow fever to the United States, to today's international flights that can carry virus-infected humans anywhere they want to go. Whenever humans have found a way to make travel easier and faster, they have also made the spread of disease easier and faster. The future plague. Today, plague can be successfully treated with antibiotics if patients get medical attention in time, but the disease is still a feared killer. In 1993, South and Central India were rattled by a severe earthquake that damaged a number of cities, including Bang- Bangalore, Bombay, Hyderabad, and Madras, as well as many smaller villages and towns. In the earthquake's aftermath, huge shanty towns and slums sprang up to the house who had been left homeless by the disaster. The shanty towns also sheltered large numbers of rats. In September 1994, plague broke out in one of the largest slums in the city of Sunrat. 55 people died, an insignificant number compared to the treble death tolls of the medieval plague epidemics, but enough to make headlines around the world. Commercial air traffic to and India stopped. The stock market in India crashed, trade halted, and the media went crazy speculating about the possibility that plague could spread to other countries, triggering a massive epidemic. Luckily, it didn't happen. Although plague is considered a disease of the past, it is alive and well and living in rodents around the world. Plague is epidemic in part of Africa, including the island of Madagascar, where the disease infection affects a few hundred people each year. In 2017, Madagascar had an outbreak of plague that was traced back to a man who developed symptoms while traveling across the island of a shared public taxi. 31 people who came into contact with him came down with plague, and 4 people died. The World Health Organization considers plague a emerging disease, a possible threat, and that requires constant monitoring. A perfect pair: cities and disease. As soon as humans started living in permanent settlements, we opened the door to disease causing microbes. Disease spread easily in crowded conditions and densely packed cities with poor sanitation are the perfect breeding ground for epidemics until the 20th century. So many cities dwellers died each year from infectious diseases that without a steady stream of new new revivals from the countryside, most cities would have been would have soon become ghost towns. Plague was one of the most feared diseases because its deadly epidemics seemed to come out of nowhere and come out nowhere and in fact the agent responsible for transmitting plague to humans is almost invisible. The culprit is the rat flea. Attracted by humans' garbage, rats had moved into the settlement bringing along their annoying roommates. Fuchsia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague in their guts and bloodstreams, and the fleas in their fur. Once a flea bites a rat infected with Fuchsia, it carries the bacteria along to the next rat or person it dines on. In the crowded, unsanitary cities, fleas jumped easily from rat to human. For many unlucky people, those flea bites weren't only itchy, they were deadly. As trade routes were established between cities, rats carrying plague went along for the ride. They spread across Asia and Europe, touching off the bubonic plague epidemic of the 1300s and the epidemic of plague that followed, including the Great Plague of London. 3 plagues of one cause. There are 3 types of plague: epidemic, endemic, and subatomic. All 3 forms of plague are caused by the same bacteria, Yersinia pestis. Epidemic plague is the most famous and the most feared, but it is actually the least deadly of the 3. In epidemic plague, the bacteria attack the lymphatic system, causing lymph nodes in the patient's neck, underarms, or groin to develop painful swelling, traditionally called bubblies, but as well as reddish or purple markings on the skin. In 17th century England, these round marks were known as plague tokens. Before the bubblies or plague tokens appeared, the patient suffers fever, headaches, chills, vomiting, and extreme exhaustion. More than half of a epidemic plague sufferers died within 2 weeks of appearance of bubblies. Pneumonic plague is even more deadly. It attacks the lungs and spreads through the air when victims cough and sneeze. Nearly everyone infected with pneumonic plague will die within 2 to 4 days. It starts with a fever and headache, but soon the victim begins coughing up blood and their lungs fill with liquid until they can no longer breathe. In septicemic plague, the rarest form of the disease, the bacteria infect the patient's bloodstream. Death can happen so quickly that sometimes no symptoms appear. When there are symptoms, they include fever and weakness, followed by bleeding from the mouth and nose and internally bleeding. Without treatment, victims of septicemic plague will die in less than a day. Today, antibiotics can successfully treat about 85% of cases of plague. If the drugs are started during the first 24 hours after infection, addicted to statistics. In 2020, the world tracked the emergence of new cases of COVID-19 day by day, and even hour by hour. The news and on social media in 1665, people watched the numbers published in the Bills of Morality just as eagerly as at least 5,000 copies of the bills were printed every week, and people snatched up to the latest issue to find out which neighborhoods had new cases and whether the epidemic was showing signs of slowing down. The bill of immorality to all our griefs is increased by 399 this week, and the increase in general through the whole city and suburbs, which makes us all sad, wrote Londer Samuel Pepys on November 9th, 1665. Anyone following the toll of COVID-19 deaths in the news and on social media would understand just how Pepys must have felt.